Okay. When you say pretty quickly, what do you mean? Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out. My name is Matthew Weise, and I'm going to go very quickly. Okay, so I'm here to talk about cinematic games. My talk is, well, you can see the title. I think traditionally cinematic games, so in a historical sense, cinematic games tend to mean games that adopt the language of cinema. So, you know, dramatic camera angles, cutting, etc. But I'm going to talk about how the term can mean so much more than that, and how some of our confusion about what cinematic means in games sometimes trips us up from doing really interesting kind of cinematic adaptations. So, I'm going to start with a little history. As you can see, these are two games from the early 80s, from two films from the early 80s. You can see E.T. on the right there and Tron on the left. And as you can see, both of those images actually refer to the exact same thing happening in the scene. And I wanted to show these because I wanted to point out the what I'm calling the representation gap, or the gap, the visual gap between film and games, which I think in the early 80s was beginning to really show itself. And this is kind of the beginning of the obsession with trying to close this gap. As you can see here, just look at the image on the right of E.T. It's literally the exact same image. But, so anyway, and I think that, you know, games industry began to become interested in closing this gap for better or for worse, but there were really some interesting attempts to do so. The image on the right is from a video game. Image on the left is from a film, but they look exactly the same because they're from the same animation studio. Image on the right, image on the left is from The Secret of Nim. The right is Dragon's Lair, and these games came out at the same, or this game, Dragon's Lair, came out at the same time, actually, as the games we saw on the previous slide in the early 80s. So you could be at an arcade and you could see that Tron light cycle thing and then walk to the left and say, oh my God, what is going on in this game that looks exactly like a movie? And of course, this game at the time just did it with these like laser discs that were cutting between clips inside an arcade cabinet, but it showed you just how powerful people wanted this idea of like, they wanted something that like looks like a movie, but actually is interactive. And I think that in the 90s, there was this, you kind of saw this tension get worked out, because in the 90s, the Laserdisc technology had become CD technology that was now cheap, and then of course there were all these, those of us who are around remember it like a dark time, the full motion video problem that video games had. And you know, you had all these cheap actors and bad writing, and you know, there were a few good ones, to be fair, not very many. And over the course of the 90s, I think that we went from this kind of pre-rendered, pre-shot attempts at having narrative, cinematic kind of dramatic angles and cutting and acting in games. We went from that slowly as kind of real-time 3D came into the stage to finding the techniques that worked with real-time 3D. Of course, you can see Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil, which were taking these dramatic camera angles and we're using cutting actually as part of the real-time gameplay. And then of course you have games like Metal Gear Solid 1, which at the time it was a big deal because it was all, there was no pre-rendered cutscenes in it, but it had a lot of cinematic cutscenes. It also used some cinematic camera angles in some of the gameplay. And then of course, and it's funny that we don't think of games like Deus Ex or other kinds of like highly immersive sims this way, but it used traditional kind of like film school 101 shot, reverse shot stuff for the conversations. And of course, I think we still see this stuff today. And I think that the dream of the interactive movie is still with us. I think we're a bit smarter about using a lot of these conventions. But I still think when you say like, oh, that game's so cinematic or this is cinematic, that you run into this, kind of the same set of ideas that kind of go back to Dragon's Lair that we're kind of better at implementing now. But it can be much more than that. So this is a game I worked on. I worked at Harmonix as a music designer. To my knowledge, I was the one person who was, there were many narrative designers on this project, but I was the one person who was hired exclusively to do narrative design on the project. And one of my jobs was to try to figure out how to make a lot of the different elements that were being kicked around at the time come together. So, you know, why is this interesting to talk about as a cinematic game? Because it was actually presented, one of the conceptual notions for the game is that it was actually being made instead of a third film. There was the first Fantasia in 1940, the second Fantasia in 2000, and then it was kind of like, okay, we're going to do this game instead of the third film. It's like, we're going to make a game of Return of the Jedi instead of actually release a movie. So that was kind of the idea. So it was interesting because we had to think about it as a film in some way, as kind of following this legacy. But of course, it was also kind of coming off the back of Dance Central and the other games that Harmonix had been making. It was a Kinect game, so it was had this very like deliberate staging where you had to always be able to see the screen, and it was hard. Not that we would want to, but even if you wanted to, it would have been really hard to do something, you know, that was more like Heavy Rain, of course, because of. Okay, I think I can skip this because I was just explaining that. So one of the things that you know we tried to do to draw it all together was to try to find the metaphorical through line between what is going on in the story of this original film, which is a kind of a concert film with all these vignettes that has a concert, it has a conductor kind of putting all this stuff together. And of course, people who know the film know that there's the Sorcerer's Apprentice vignette in the middle of it. But one of the things that was kind of clear about it is that, and it's funny, if you actually watch the film, even though this is kind of never explicitly stated, the film has a whole lot of people pointing at things and making things happen without touching them. So there's a whole lot of like Mickey kind of pointing at stuff, and even, you know, the devil, or as technically he's a Slavic god, but when I was a kid, I was like, oh, it's Satan. But so it's, you know, so there's quite a lot of this kind of like pointing at stuff and making things happen, you know, and this is very much kind of the fantasy of magic. And so we tried to bring this all together under this sort of central idea of it being kind of like the idea that in the 1940, Fantasia kind of already was a Kinect game in a way, a Kinect game that was kind of waiting almost a century to kind of be made. So so this is where the cinematic aspect of it comes in. So it's not using cinematic camera angles. It's not using these kind of traditional elements that we expect from games like, you know, The Walking Dead or Heavy Rain. But, you know, for us, to some extent, narrative design was interface design, right? So it was not about it was not about just copying cinematic language. It was about looking for visual elements in the film and not just copying the image, but trying to figure out what the image meant and how that meaning could be transferred to a game by using the language of games. And of course, if you see on those images on the upper left, there's the conductor in the original film, and another image on the left of these kind of like instruments from the original film. And on the right, this is like a UI kind of screen in the actual game where you actually see your silhouette embodied as this. And people who know Kinect know that that's the animation data that the game is getting from you. So that was kind of a very clear take from the film. And it wasn't about copying the visual language, but it was about, but you can look at it and you can see there's a very clear reference to a 1940 film. So I can't think of a lot of other games that use a 1940 film as the kind of a reference for their UX. You know, so this also this was also kind of like a general idea that kind of permeated every aspect of the game. And kind of like ended up making the story, we ended up finding a story that was kind of trying to find the intersection of all these things across all these different narrative axes. So it became a story about, you know, the music and magic all being kind of represented as this ability to control things without touching them. And of course, because it's a music game, being able to control them through music. And you can see this in the film. You can see the film is like a blueprint, not just for how the game looks, but for how the game functions in a really deep way. So another game I worked on last year was, how many people saw this movie, Transcendence? No, almost nobody. It was a movie starring Johnny Depp where he gets his brain downloaded into a computer and Johnny Depp becomes Shodan, and that's the movie. And so so I was working at a small team that was hired basically to, with very little money. They were like, can you make The Walking Dead in 2 months? And we were like, no. So they're like, but we want characters and dialogue and dramatic things happening. And we're like, well, if there's literally no animation, maybe we can do that. So we ended up with, one of the inspirations actually is this, how many people know this film? La Jetée? So this movie is the original, and you may even recognize it if you're familiar with 12 Monkeys, but this is the film that 12 Monkeys is based on. But it's a movie without motion. It's a story without motion. There's no animation. It's just sound and still images. And this movie always made a big impact on me and some of the other people making this game. And one of the things that we noticed in the film is that when brain data is downloaded, it appears in the world of the film as still images. So we thought, okay, well, this is a mobile game. So, you know, if we're looking for something that, you know, can have characters, but can't have animation, and we can have sound, and UI art is cheap to make, but how can we build this all together into a central idea? So we thought that a game where you're kind of moving these kind of clips, snippets of somebody's life that kind of manifest as kind of these still images. We could make that into something that was like a kind of Instagram app or something that was like a kind of phone app, phone picture app that you could put a story together that way. Also stories without motion. One of the cool things about this is that we got to go to LA and actually shoot all these. We had actors, we had sets, we had lighting and all this stuff. We didn't have motion camera, we just had a still camera. And this was interesting because this actually was narrative design, this was gameplay. This was essentially like I was directing shots, but it was puzzle design because I had to choose a shot. I had to choose series of shots that would make sense to be cut together. And in this case, the cutting together was not just about creating the story, but also about creating the design of how well, if it's the same object in all these shots, maybe that's the clue for the player. So there was a lot of puzzle design, and we couldn't go back for reshoots. So basically, we just had to shoot everything we could possibly think of to figure out how to put puzzles together and then just use what we had. But it seemed to work out pretty well. And then the final game was this game where you can move these little icons around that represent the memories, and you can kind of zoom in on them to look at them, and then when you're done with them, you kind of put them together out of order, and then you have to try to figure out what's going on. And it's very much using the gaps of the narrative as a way to try to get the player emotionally and intellectually engaged in what's going on. Of course, because they really wanted talking in the game and moral choices, we were like, okay, well, we can't do The Walking Dead with talking and moral choices with this reverse shot 3D characters, but hey, what if the game just all takes place on a tablet? And you're a graduate student who's using a tablet, and one app on the tablet is the memory shuffling, and the other app is actually a chat window with Kate Mara on it talking to you about stuff. So that's what we did. And so, the thing I want to emphasize here is that obviously, even in some of the examples, I think especially in the second one, in the Transcendence one, there was some use of traditional cinematic language. But the point is that you don't have to reproduce the language in exactly as it is in the film, right? It's not about just looking like a film. Obviously, it's about choosing the aspect of a film. I don't want to say that already fits in with the existing contours of game design, because I think we should also use cinema as a way to kind of push us in new directions. It's not just about what are the blank spots we have and, oh, we can drop this in there, right? I mean, that sometimes works, but I think that, we would have never come up with the idea of using La Jetée as an inspiration for a game if we, if some of these other constraints hadn't been apparent. So, I think in our particular cases, in the case of these particular games, there was kind of narrative as interface design and narrative as editing as a kind of approach to what it means to make something cinematic or at least inspired by a film. And I just want to end with by saying really quick that, obviously I'm not against using kind of what we traditionally think of more as cinematic language in a game. I mean, I think that some games use it very, very well, like the running animation when you're running in Gears of War is basically just ripped right out of Saving Private Ryan, but it really makes a lot of sense, I think, in that game. And of course, there's other games where you have these kind of micro cutscenes that actually don't take you away from the game at all, and I think that's fine. I mean, I think that one of the problems can happen when we get really obsessed with this, and it's kind of like, the kind of, the holy grail of this kind of obsession that kind of goes back to the original E.T. and Tron game, can get in the way of usability and the player being kind of in the world. Of course, any of you are familiar with Heavy Rain. Now, and I think there's a lot of really good stuff in Heavy Rain, but the scene where you're kind of in it feels like this scene where you're kind of in this tunnel, really, it feels like the challenge is not trying to get through the tunnel. The challenge is trying to get through the tunnel with a cameraman that is constantly trying to, show pictures of you. And I just want to end with this quote that I really like from this film. This is from a audio commentary that comes with the film. So this is a shot on the right is from Pleasantville, which is a film about these people who get sucked into, kind of magically sucked into a 1950s TV show. And one of the things that the director says in the commentary is that he defends the kind of fact that beyond being black and white, the film doesn't look at all like a sitcom, doesn't look at all like a 50s sitcom. You can see from the lighting here, it's dramatic. It has this kind of dramatic camera angles and lighting that are not anything like a sitcom. And he says in the commentary track that we're not in a sitcom, we're in the world of a sitcom. We're using the language of cinema to describe what it feels like to be in the world of a sitcom. And I can't think of a better way to describe, for me, what it means to make a cinematic game or to make a game that is inspired by cinema in some way. For me, it's not about it's not about being in a movie. It's about being in the world of a movie and not necessarily using cinematic language, but using the language of games, the language of interface, the language of action to recreate what it feels like to be inside that cinematic world. And this is just one really final example, is a really good example of something that's not cinematic at all. Just the fact in Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes that you can choose to play Ride of the Valkyries in your helicopter allows you to replicate the scene from Apocalypse Now, but it has nothing to do with cutscenes, has nothing to do with anything. It's simply a choice of using a particular music track in conjunction with a set of mechanics. And I think hopefully as we move forward, we can, again, if we use cinematic angles when we feel like it's really necessary, it fits, that's fine, but I think that we should really not be trapped by that, and we should really find these kind of interesting, organic, and new ways to really have this more fruitful relationship between games and cinema, where they really help each other and take us into all these new directions. Thank you.